Suzanne, you mentioned a word that I think we use a lot at NARF. John Echohawk uses it, and probably if you had to use one word to define our work and why we do it, and that's the word sovereignty. It all comes down to sovereignty. NARF being a nonprofit, we're limited in what we can do. We're limited in the amount and types of cases that we can take on. And Suzanne, you mentioned the 5 priorities that were set up by the original steering committee that still guide NARF today after 46 years, so they work pretty well. What I'd like to do, if I can ask the panel, is kind of maybe just let's talk about those priorities and maybe chat about some of the work that we've done in each area or looking to do, and then kind of give folks an idea as to maybe how we pick those cases based on the priorities and some examples of how we use it. The first one is preservation of tribal existence. A lot of people, folks out there may not really, understand how complex it is to be a federally recognized tribe or to get recognition, or the fact that there are tribes that may have lost their recognition through the termination era or through way back when, even just falling through the cracks, not ever being recognized as a tribe. Can I ask the panel to maybe talk about that a little bit and some examples and maybe how NARF stepped in to kind of redress those wrongs?
Sure, Don. Hello, everyone again. My name is Matt Campbell. I'm a staff attorney at NARF. I'm enrolled in the village of Gambell. And when I think about preservation of tribal existence, we do a lot of recognition cases. But actually was just thinking about that, and what came to my mind was the Indian Child Welfare Act, actually, protecting children, our native children, from being adopted outside of the tribe. Our members is what makes up our tribes and our existence. And NARF has long been involved in the Indian Child Welfare Act and protecting ICWA, as it's referred to. And ICWA is somewhat, it was passed in the 70s, and it was passed, when they were discussing passing it, they talked about the history of Native children being taken away from Native families just because the children lived on the reservation. And just because they lived on the reservation, that meant they were being neglected oftentimes. And so Native children were really being taken away from their tribal families at very high rates. And one thing that touches me personally is that my dad was actually adopted from the village of Gambell in the 1950s. Before ICWA was passed, he was adopted by my grandpa, who was actually a Presbyterian minister on the village. He's a missionary there. And for those of you that don't know, the village of Gambell is on an island in the Bering Strait in Alaska. You can actually see Russia on a clear day. But, my dad would have definitely been affected by the Indian Child Welfare Act after it had been passed. And because he was adopted, I ended up growing up in Colorado. I didn't grow up in the village. I really didn't learn much of my culture or history. And so I was disconnected from it for a very long time. And so was my dad still to this day. Knowing now that the history behind ICWA, the history behind why it was passed, and now today still that it's being challenged heavily by adoption agencies and foster families and big high-profile firms, and that NARF is still, to this day, has a project to work to protect the Indian Child Welfare Act, nationwide, working with NICWA, the National Indian Child Welfare Association, I believe, to protect ICWA, to protect our tribal existence, to keep our children connected to our tribes and our families. And so that was just one thing that came to my mind when I think about the preservation of tribal existence.
And the boarding school.
Yeah, and we also, what Suzanne mentioned is we also have a boarding school healing project and have worked with a boarding school, Native National, NAVS. I don't actually remember what it is. NAVS. It's a coalition that NARF worked to create to protect.
Geraldine, what's the correct acronym?
National Native American Boarding School Healing Association.
Thank you.
Yeah. Sorry about that.
Thank you. Geraldine is the board chair, right, of NABS. That's why I asked you.
So I butchered that, but sorry.
That's good.
I think one other area to mention as far as preserving tribal existence, right now there's a real movement, I think, among Native Americans and other indigenous peoples worldwide to re-embrace our common roots as being indigenous peoples. And NARF has represented the National Congress of American Indians since 1992 on working within the UN system to help that system figure out how it protects indigenous people's rights globally. And when I think about being an indigenous person, I don't confine that to being a Native American or to this continent. I think we all have some really important common roots where, if we were colonized, if we had that history where we've had to survive through assimilation and attempted genocide. And that still goes on today in many parts of the world. And so what we're doing at the UN, I think, is really important because we're acknowledging our responsibility to other indigenous peoples all over the world to keep them from being annihilated and to help make things like the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples a reality and something that we can actually utilize as a tool to protect our rights.
Thanks, Heather. As Native people, our people are very important for our tribal existence. The integrity and the intactness of our Native people are so important. But another area that is equally important, especially as tribes develop and have developed and want to continue developing economically, is the protection of our tribal natural resources. All too often, our resources for many tribes are under attack, whether it's land, whether it's the minerals and other materials beneath the surface, water, could be a number of things. And NARF has been very intimately involved in the fight for the protection of those natural resources as well. So again, I'm going to turn to the panel and maybe we can chat about that a little bit.
One of the first cases that NARF took was the many cases that led to what's known as the Boulder decision, the Indian Treaty fishing rights decision in the Pacific Northwest and Columbia River, and then that became the model for later treaty rights, hunting and fishing in the Great Lakes area. But the first case was decided by Judge George Bolt, and in looking at all the Stevens treaties, he ruled, federal district court judge in Washington State, he ruled that the Indian tribes, most of them are called tribes, some of them have the duly constituted name nation, and that all the nations and tribes in the Pacific Northwest were eligible for half of the harvestable catch of anadromous fish, so fish that love the salt water and love the fresh water, and that's salmon and sturgeon basically. And so his ruling was eligible for half the harvestable catch. And he took that from the language of fishing in common from the treaties with the non-native people. And that these were on reservation and off reservation rights at usual and accustomed fishing areas. And that this was an economic issue because he was talking about commercial rights, commercial fishing. And it was a religious issue because he was talking about ceremonial rights. And it was a subsistence issue, talking about food. And the Stevens treaties also, as well as fishing and hunting, also included gathering. And part of gathering is this subsistence area. So that took, NARF was instrumental, David Getches and Charles Wilkinson and many others in making that a successful case, in winning that case. And one of the people who had worked at California Indian Legal Services early on was Reed Chambers, and then he went to work in the Nixon administration as associate solicitor for Indian affairs. And when the Bolt decision came down, he went to his boss, the solicitor, Kent Frizzell, and to Roger C.B. Morton, who was the Secretary of the Interior. And he said, Judge Bolt has delivered his decision, and the Indians get half of the harvestable catch, on and off reservation rights. And Morton said, well, appeal it. He said, we can't, Mr. Secretary, we won. So, and the case was U.S. v. Washington, and NARF was all throughout the entire record of that. NARF expertise and bringing in other expert witnesses and building up Frank's Landing Indian community and Native nations that were part of that particular treaty, the Medicine Creek Treaty, which would be Puyallup and Nisqually nations and Squaxin Island. So this was something that was so far-reaching that the Bolt cases still go on. I mean, that particular case went up to the Supreme Court, and they said, we've seen this case 5 times this century. We don't want to see it again. And they have it. And then there was a litigation about environmental degradation and restoration of the habitat and how you do that. And that's resulted in the current dismantling of 5 dams that were built that impeded the progress of the salmon as they continued their life cycle. And the anadromous fish decision was then litigated and extended to shellfish, and these continue on and on. And NARF was absolutely essential to the development of that law and that set of laws. And as I said, it was in all those areas, 3 of NARF's priority areas: economic development, human rights and religious freedom, really, and subsistence. So I just wanted to give that background about NARF as instrumental to U.S. v. Washington.
Thanks, Suzanne. Since I have